Good morning, everyone. It's very hard to follow an erudite CEO, a very energetic minister, and a very cerebral chair of ESCOM. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. So I'm sure in our program we got everybody's CV, so I won't waste any of our time introducing them. But as I ask each of them to speak, I will say something maybe slightly personal about them that you may not know yet. So I'm going to kick off to my right. Mark Swilling, known to many as Professor. He and I went to the same school, different generations at high school. I'll leave it to your imagination as to who's younger. Mark, I would like to kick off, given we were given that tour de force in terms of given that big picture. And I think we know what the problem statement is. And I'd like to shift maybe the conversation from problematizing to possible solutions. I read one of your papers that you published in 23 titled Linking the Energy Transitions and Economic Development, a framework for analysis for energy transitions in the Global South. I wonder, I decided as they were talking to kind of shift the conversation slightly. I wonder if I could ask you to kind of give us a view of some of the opportunities of global transitions, specific global energy transitions in the Global South. Maybe leaning a little bit into that paper, leaning a little bit into the work that you do generally as part of the Center for Sustainable Transitions.
Wow, I'm glad we went to the same school. I think a point of departure for me in this conversation would be to take the title of today seriously, which is charting Africa's pathway to net zero. So I'd like to take your question as an opportunity to go beyond the South African equation, which is what has dominated the conversation this morning, for good reason, obviously. And for me, when we think of the African transition, we think we need to start with the Nairobi Declaration. So in September last year, under the leadership of President Ruto in Kenya, we had Africa's first Africa Climate Summit. And that summit produced something called the Nairobi Declaration. I won't ask you to put up your hands to find out how many of you have read this. If you do read this document, in particular focus on the last quarter of the document, which is all about reform of the global financial system, and calls that were made there for very substantial reforms to the global financial system were echoed in the Pact for the Future that was adopted by the Summit of the Future that took place a week or two ago, the UN Summit. And the Pact, Action 47 of the Pact for the Future says the following: we will accelerate reform of the international financial architecture to address the challenges of today and tomorrow. That was an echo of the Nairobi Declaration. And why is it that when thinking about climate change, African leaders are emphasizing reform of the global financial system? Well, that's got a lot to do with the way in which Africa is inserted into the global financial system. And if you take into account the fact that debt is 25% of Africa's GDP, if you look at capital flight, which is illegal outflows of capital out of Africa over the last 20 years, it's 3 times bigger than total African debt. If you take into account the estimates of what it's going to cost to invest in the energy transition in Africa, it ranges between 99 billion per annum and 240 billion per annum from the African Development Bank, Climate Policy Initiative, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Development, and most recently, the Mo Abraham Foundation coming out with very similar estimates. So massive investment requirements, in terrible debt distress levels, very high cost of capital, between 5 and 8, and sometimes 10, 15%, compared to richer countries which are paying 1 or 2% before interest rates went up. If those countries in Africa in debt distress were paying 1 or 2 or 3% interest, they wouldn't be in that position. So cost of capital, access to capital, access to the kinds of concessional finance that is inside of what was referred to earlier, the IPG package, all of that is necessary for Africa to start addressing its challenges. But I just want to end off with one final comment, which is South Africa has played a critical role in crafting the narrative of a just transition, because it's not just about investing in low-carbon development on the African continent. We were the first to put just transition in our NDC. We were the first to put the just transition in our auction mechanism for procuring renewables. We were the first to put just transition into an investment plan, the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And that has become a global narrative now. But there's 4 ways in which this is used. 1, it's just about trickle down. Invest as quickly as possible in renewables for growth. 2, yes, we need decarbonization plus social mitigation to mitigate the social impacts on coal workers. 3, all of that plus upstream industrialization. And 4thly, from unions and radical NGOs, just transition is only possible in a post-capitalist transformation. What's significant about the JET IP, which many other Africans are following, is that it moved the dial from the 2nd to the 3rd position. That the investments in the energy transition are part of the industrialization or reindustrialization of our economies in preparation for what's coming in the rest of the century. So I think Africa's got huge opportunities, but I think we need to take seriously what emerged from the Nairobi Declaration and echoed in the Pact for the Summit, a Pact for the Future, which is the global financial architecture, and therefore the role of institutions like Standard Bank, has to be rethought. After all, that system was designed to finance a fossil fuel-based industrial economy of the last 200 years. We're in transition, and so the financial system is being rethought. And in South Africa, in February next year, we have the Finance in Common Summit, which is the summit of all the 522 DFIs in the world. And one of the streams in that conference that I chair is how do we practically think about reform of the global financial system?
Wonderful, thank you. I think you are taking us straight into some hard, difficult conversations, Rensha. We were told earlier that economist is not a precise science, but thankfully you're not an economist, you're a mathematician. So you're quite precise. You also know that 1 + 1 is 2. Could you precisely help us to understand how Standard Bank and other financial institutions can navigate some of the challenges and opportunities that Mark is speaking about when he talks about the reforming of global financial systems? How is Standard Bank inserting itself, and how does Standard Bank think other financial institutions need to insert themselves into this reform agenda?
Thanks, Prof. I'm not sure if I can still add 1 and 1, but I'll definitely try. I think what is very important is to understand the deep sector knowledge and understanding of Standard Bank across all our global focus sectors, not only in the countries we operate in, but also where we entrench with our clients and when we solution with our clients. So when we look at how do we support energy transition, energy support across these markets, we focus on how do we unlock funding, how do we support the development. And there's 2 key focus areas that I think is worth highlighting in terms of our strategy. The first one is the markets we operate in. Each and every country we entrenched in, we got a presence in, got a specific focus and commitment around how they want to support climate change, their commitments in terms of transformation, and ultimately energy security. So when we look at the opportunities, we do focus on that roadmap? How do we as a bank support the enabling environment and development of projects that can ultimately achieve that roadmap that is quite specific to a country? One energy diversification strategy for one country may not be relevant for a different country. And I think that is where we are entrenched in those conversations. The second pillar that I think is critical is our client-centric approach around how do we support our clients. Having a deep understanding around the specific pain points. Many of our clients have different drivers when they look at energy diversification. Is it only because of cost or long-term stability and foresight in terms of where my energy cost will be? Is it my pain points around lack of supply? Or is it simply an ESG drive where I would like to ensure that I procure and buy green power in terms of my product that I want to produce and the full value chain to be able to drive and grow my business? So I think from that perspective, it's very important for us as a bank operating in all these markets to be quite nimble and open around the different solutions. How do we fund that? How do we support blended finance solutions? I always say it's not only about Standard Bank being the sole MLA, but how do we leverage DFIs and produce and fund ultimately those projects and those clients that can make a difference in driving growth?
So when I come back to you, Rensha, I hope you can also then help us to understand how we then insert the just in the energy transition path that you were just outlining to us. I love the idea of roadmaps that are specific to each country. Then let's be a little bit more specific then to Nigeria. So often we are listening to academics and funders talking. We don't quite hear enough policymakers giving us a view. We had a rare example of an erudite policymaker speaking earlier today. Right. So Deo is, I forgot to introduce Rensha properly, but I'll give a little bit of her personality later. But maybe not. That look, it reminds me of the look I got last night. Not from Rensha, from another person. Deo, I think I might regret that statement. Deo is like us, like me at the very least, a private sector person who is now dabbling in the public sector as the chief technical advisor to the Honorable Minister of Power in Nigeria. Deo, you know South Africa quite well. You have family here, but you're Nigerian, you live in the palaces of power in Nigeria. Help us to understand how Nigeria navigates this notion. Here I'm going to ask you to distinguish between energy transition and this concept of just energy transition as well.
Correct. Professor, thank you very much. I think the idea of energy transition is very critical. It's critical for Africa, it's critical for sub-Saharan Africa, it's critical for Nigeria, for South Africa the same. But I think what's even more critical is energy security and how you actually link both. So from a policy perspective, I think we've looked at it as every country must use their natural endowment. And if you just decide to transition for transition's sake, you have a challenge of also meeting your energy security requirements. So for example, in Nigeria, we've said gas must be used as a transition fuel. In South Africa, you have 80% generation as coal. In Nigeria, we have 75 to 80% generation as gas. If in the next 5 years we decided to transition totally away from gas, what happens to that entire value chain? Then you start to go into the areas of the social impact of a transition. How do you make it just? And I think in the bigger picture of it, it is also net zero, right? The idea is to have a net zero target, not necessarily zero from fossil fuel. So there has to be a balance. And I think that's how we're looking at it. From a policy point of view, we have taken a decision that gas must be a transition fuel. We must continue to diversify our energy mix with solar, wind, and other renewable sources. You have to strengthen the grid. I'm really glad to see the chair of ESCOM and all the work that has been done on the policy side and on the regulatory side. Because without strengthening the grid, in all reality, it's very difficult to have sustainability of a transition. The grid is so critical to deliver bulk variable energy anyway. And the investment that you require on the grid is also as critical as the investment you require in the generation sources. A lot of the time, people just focus on the fact that you want to transition. How do you actually deliver this energy? The type of investment you need on the grid when you are moving from fossil fuel to intermittent energy is also quite different. You need a lot of communication, you need a lot of SCADA, you need a lot of overview to be able to manage intermittent energy. The same on the distribution network. How do you ensure this is delivered? So from our side, we are trying to look at it end to end. And one of the things that we've truly focused on is the alignment between legislation. We have a new Electricity Act, development of an electricity policy that is aligned to that legislation, looking at reforms. And then the critical thing for us is also the tariff policy. I know that the ESCOM chair spoke about it, and the Honorable Minister also spoke about it. Part of the challenge in Africa, regardless of how you want to transition, is a tariff question. How do you get to a cost-reflective tariff to catalyze private sector investment? You've seen that for the just energy transition for South Africa, I believe it was 1.5 trillion. I believe from a lot of the work we've done, it's $10 billion a year. Government cannot afford it. So how do you then look at the whole picture to also ensure that you're able to attract private sector investment? A lot of that boils down to the tariff and the environment in which you operate. And then you have a counter argument, which we have to also face, which is the affordability question. It's a balance that you have. We have to find the sweet spot. But the reality is that there will be no transition if you do not have a tariff that also attracts the private sector investment. It is very, very significant. And then the last point I'll make is the local content aspect of a just energy transition. We must not just go headlong into a transition that does not drive a local value chain in some of the countries. We have to look at how, so for example, if you're going to spend $10 billion a year, you cannot just spend the $10 billion that is also debt on just importation of equipment. There has to be a build-up of local value chain. If sub-Saharan Africa's 600 million individuals without energy access are to be energized, sub-Saharan Africa is going to spend a lot of money, a lot of capital. What is the capacity of local content within the region to produce batteries, to produce solar panels, to produce equipment within the value chain that would also allow some of that capital to be kept within the continent? I think we have to look at all these points to ensure that this transition is truly just and it meets the needs of each country and the region as a whole.
So maybe we'll come back particularly to the last comment that you made there around local content, because I think it's an important point, one that is underexplored in many conversations when we're having a conversation around the just energy transition. And it's also a huge opportunity. I hope that, Salim, you've been able to resolve your connection issues. Let me know if Salim is online. Salim? We can, but not very well. We're hearing an echo, Salim. We'll come back to you, Salim. Thank you. Mark, I wonder if I'd like to ask all three maybe to stay on this local content perspective. Can you give us a sense from a policy perspective how you think policymakers are thinking about this, the challenges and opportunities of local content, the local content requirement, and how it might really make a positive contribution over time as a key lever of this concept of just energy transitions?
Okay, just an opening comment to put it in a global context.
Yep.
There's quite a number of countries that have wrestled with this, and the very painful and difficult choices are going slower on the energy infrastructure in order to maximize on local content, or going faster on your energy infrastructure, importing and compromising your local your local content program. It's a very difficult balance, and I think that's exactly what you're referring to, to finding that balance. In the South African context, we have the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, which was drawn up by a group of people who really have thought quite carefully around this challenge. And I think that's where policy is heading, is what kinds of investment requirements should we be thinking about that will make it possible for us to find that sweet spot, to use your words, that balance. At the moment, we are heavily dependent on importing the kit for our accelerated program of investing in renewables. And if you look at the size of the pipeline, roughly around 30 gigs, which, by the way, is much bigger than many of the projections that were made 2 or 3 years ago estimated we should be at this point. We're actually, at the moment, where we should be in 2030. So we kind of almost, just in terms of the pressure to procure and expand the pipeline, it's very difficult to imagine how we can accelerate local procurement. So just in my own context, a national transmission company that I sit on the board of, one of the only companies that produces substations recently caught fire and went into business rescue. And we have to import hundreds of substations. That's not a good place to be. The Steel Master Plan Steering Committee that has been formed to take forward the Steel Master Plan is meeting on Thursday with the board of the National Transmission Company to propose a steel master plan, a revival of the steel industry based on a coupling with the build program of the National Transmission Company, in particular the lattices and cables. Substations is a bit of a bridge too far at the moment. So I think for me, the Steel Master Plan Steering Committee have drafted a document that is starting to address how we get to this sweet spot, this balance between the pace of the energy transition and our capacity to ramp up our local content program. And that's where we should be. That's probably the lead example. In my
Before I come to you, Rensha, it seems to me, my understanding is that one of the key levers of local content, Mark, is this idea that you need market size in order to absorb the investment required to get the right return on investment. And if we are to think of local content at a country level, other than maybe Nigeria and Ethiopia and possibly Egypt, we don't have markets that are big enough to justify this idea of local content. Isn't there an opportunity to think of local content on a regional basis, as opposed to at a single country level? Imagine if you're Botswana, for example. Doesn't seem to make sense given the population size. What is your experience in that regard?
Well, I'm sure we would agree that within the context of the African Free Trade framework, it doesn't make sense for every country on a national basis to craft its own local content program. I mean, if we all decided to build capacity for building substations, doesn't make a lot of sense. So which ones? Which countries are best positioned, for example, to compete with the international market in substations? And what are the value chains and resource flows that lie behind that? So it makes a huge amount of sense. If you look at Somebody mentioned critical minerals. We have on the African continent what the rest of the world needs. Critical minerals, the best biodiversity resources for adaptation, and the best wind and solar resources. But we don't have what the North has, which is capital. How do we bring those together in an incrementalist way that maximizes on the potential of different countries within the free trade context? That's the conversation that
Isn't
we need
that
to
where
have.
Standard Bank comes in, Rensha? Bringing capital to these opportunities. And if indeed it does so, how is Standard Bank thinking about bringing capital, whether it's its own capital or in partnership with other funders, into this really interesting opportunity mix that people like Mark and Deo are presenting?
Yeah, I think, Prof, we can talk about localization and the drive around how we get there and how do we facilitate that. And it's not only a funding conversation, it's to your earlier point around sustainable market development, ensure that you do have the pipeline to establish that factory or that establishment to be able to support that on the long term. And I think part of the challenges we had as a bank battling in terms of financing those type of manufacturing outlets is that sustainability factor in terms of long-term future supply into markets, not only in South Africa, which on paper looks great, it's big, it's 30 gigawatt, but at the end of the day, how much are we actually executing, closing, and getting commercialized within that time frame to be able to support the sustainable development? And I think that's where we need to think differently around regional connectivity and back to transmission. I mean, the point that was made around the substation that blew up, it's one of our projects. So we experienced that delay in terms of reaching commercial operation, the ability to source those equipment quite quickly. So it's not only a funding dilemma, it's also around having access to those suppliers immediately, because now you lose 3 months, 6 months, where your contractor is idle, you can't execute. So the role that the bank plays, not only through the strategic alignment and sourcing and partnering with the right clients around value creation, but crowding in the capital at the different levels of the capital stack. And I think what we see is, debt come as soon as it's a bankable proposition. Sometimes you need the equity investor to be able to see the foresight, have the foresight and have the ability to develop and take that first step. And maybe we should think a bit different around crowding in investors to be able to take that leap and put the equity down.
So Deo, you kicked us off on this issue of local content. I wonder, given you do a lot of work in East Africa, but you also do a lot of work and you live in West Africa, how is this local content issue playing out in those two different regions, for example? We've heard a South African view from both Rensha and Mark. How is it playing out in West and East Africa?
Okay, maybe I'll just start from the perspective that actually the best way to drive local content in Africa would be on a regional perspective. But of course the challenge is that every country is always focused on themselves first, rather than thinking about the region. So there just has to be a way where that connection is made. One of the key points we made to the World Bank and the African Development Bank, because there's a program called Mission 300, which the idea is to electrify 300 million Africans by 2030, and by investing $30 billion. So of course we believe that based on the access gap we have in Nigeria, right? So 50 million of that 300 million could easily come from Nigeria. But the point there is, if there is no local value chain with that, how do you truly deliver it where you're going to be able to not only have the scale, but to have the multiplier effect on the economy, to actually drive individuals that could also eventually pay for the electricity? Because it is all connected. When you look at it from a policy point of view, you want to drive local content, you want to drive a commercially available product for the private sector, but you also want to drive affordability for those using electricity. Without really connecting all those dots, you don't achieve anything. And that's why the local content discussion has to be regional. It just has to be regional, and that's our message to the World Bank and AFDB, that if this Mission 300 project is really going to go ahead for sub-Saharan Africa, there has to be a clear thought around how local content is going to be placed to drive those projects. I would say in West Africa, we have a lot of deposits for lithium and battery production and processing. I think that there has to be a clarity on how that value chain is to be created. How do you drive battery production for Africa in Africa? A lot of the lithium is also exported out of Africa to then return as battery storage, as BESS for Africa. So I'm not asking us to try to produce things that we don't have economies of scale on. Because, for example, China produces the cheapest solar PVs. It's just the reality. And they have so much scale. And they are building so much capacity on a daily basis that they are supplying their own domestic market. It may be difficult to compete with, but you have to look at where you potentially have economies of scale, where you have the capacity to deliver efficiently, and see how you keep that value within the region. And the Africa Free Trade Agreement is a good leverage for us to actually pull on. The reality with the electricity value chain is that there's a lot of technology involved as well. And as you said, substation equipment, transformers, SCADA equipment, switchgear, whatever you may look at it, not every country can produce it. That I can for sure guarantee. But you do have some countries that potentially have a market where it may make sense for a private sector. And like South Africa, that has a technology advantage compared to a lot of African countries, can also leverage on that pretty quicker than a lot of the other African countries where you might actually have a market. So I think it's connecting those dots and keeping that balance that would actually allow us to be able to achieve that local content from a regional perspective.
Wonderful. So I do need to make an announcement that sadly we've been data shared. Mr. Salim Fakir is not able to join us. We lost a signal from Cape Town. It's a real pity because he brings enormous experience from the African Climate Foundation, also having worked with WWF and World Conservation. And I mention this because I want to shift the conversation slightly, because we're talking today about this concept of just transition. And it's easy for us, and I noted a comment earlier that you made that we are shaping the narrative of just transition, Mark. But turns out the concept of a just transition dates back to the 70s when dealing with environmental issues where companies were behaving badly. And it would really have been great to hear Salim's view from that perspective. But I wonder if we could start connecting the various transitions that are taking place. We're talking about energy transition, we're talking about environmental transitions and social transitions. How do you think at a policy level, Mark, whether it's policy from a government perspective that Deyo represents, or policy as strategy as from a company perspective that Rensha represents on the panel here, how do you think from a policy perspective we should be thinking about these various transitions that are taking place?
I mean, you're right. Environmental justice does come out of the 1970s, but it tended to be about pollution impacts on local communities. It's shifted fundamentally. Just transition is now about structural transformation in the context of a global economy going through fundamental changes as a result of a shift in the resource base. So you're right to ask the question of how these connect. And I think the connection that I want to make specifically is investments in mitigation, which is really what investments in the energy transition is about, are far, far, far in excess of investments in adaptation. And the adaptation challenge is the African challenge. Because actually, as the MC for the day pointed out, the African contribution to global emissions is actually very limited, but we suffer the consequences. To quote Nick Stern, Africa will suffer first and most from the effects of climate change. So where are the investments in adaptation? And what I mean by adaptations is investments in the capacity of African countries to adjust to the consequences, which are pretty much now unstoppable. Most climate scientists are saying we're not going to make the 1.5 target. We're heading towards the 2-degree target. If you look at the consequences of that, it is drastic. For example, Southern Africa is warming at twice the rate of the global average. And if you look at the drought spreading out across, as we speak, sub-Saharan Africa, but Southern Africa in particular, you can see the evidence of that, especially Botswana, which is the hottest part of the whole of the subcontinent. What's the adaptation strategy there? That's a transition in water resources, in forestry, in soils, in particular soils. The last IPCC report said 50% of African agriculture is threatened. South African climate scientists are saying the maize crop is threatened. They're saying that a day zero in Gauteng is a real possibility. What are the investments in the adaptation capabilities of our societies, given that we actually can't stop some of these processes? They're going to unfold.
Wonderful.
And that's a different kind of transition to windmills and solar panels.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to be opening up for questions. So I hope there's a mic that can do the rounds so that the people online can also get to hear what's happening in the room. Rensha, I wonder if you could give us a sense of how Standard Bank is shaping up along this line of funding for mitigation versus funding for adaptation.
Yeah, I think it's, if you look at the projects we finance, but not only the large-scale utility projects, but also the road we walk with our clients, it's a conversation linked to mitigation and to adaptation. And I think if you map out sustainable finance, what we achieve there, how do we look at these key performance areas, and the need for that, and the client conversations around how do we shape that and brought bigger discussion around implementation. It is such an interesting field. I don't think we got all the answers. I mean, as we go along, we learn, we develop, we adapt as a bank. We learn to listen more to our clients and to be able to analyze the risks. And I think, sometimes many of our clients say, but you always throw bankability and risk to us. When are you actually being more proactive? And that's exactly what we're doing. We've seen where we step out of that space and talk about how do we impact the community and support the development as part of the larger scale developments in these projects. You see the difference that you make. And I want to use a small example. And when you go to visit some of these projects and you see the actual impact of what you do and what you achieve, it's not about necessarily only putting out the funding and fund the project and go through the pain to reach that COD level at last, but actually to see the difference that you make in terms of the lives on the ground. And people underestimate.
So can you give us one example of a case that is close to your heart, that allows you to go to the credit committee from time to time and take all the beatings that you get?
There's definitely a few examples that I would love to use, but I think maybe the latest one is what we as a bank have achieved through working with a client that is mainly entrenched in the coal sector, and I can mention the client, Seriti Resources, and we as a bank, through 4 years of engagement, then assisted the client to be able to acquire and look at opportunities in that corridor of Mpumalanga. Acquire a project developer in renewable energy, and we're busy building the first 155 megawatt wind power project in that community in the Mpumalanga corridor. And remember, that is where we may see a lot of jobs being lost due to the decommissioning of some of the power stations. And I mean, last week we had a site visit there. Unfortunately, I couldn't join, but 240 youth employees are actually from the community already employed on that project. Thanks. And that's the type of things that you see with another 300 megawatt that we're currently developing with the client to be able to execute in the next 6 months. And for me, if you go there and you see the impact, make a point and do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. There, from a policy perspective, you need to beat that one as an example of what can be done at scale, because Standard Bank here is talking about what they did with one client.
Right.
What can Nigeria do at a country level, at a regional level, in navigating this mitigation and adaptation challenge that Mark so deftly put out for us?
Okay, thank you for that. I'm not sure beating the next person is the actual end goal, but I think we've done two things. So there has been a focus on gas flaring. So we've looked at the impact of gas flaring. How do you then look at those gas flaring regions, capture the gas, convert it to CNG, and you can then use it for generation. Now,
so you're taking a negative
correct
externality and converting it into a positive externality.
Exactly, because then you may look at it and say, what's the benefit in that? There is a significant benefit in that, where you're previously gas flaring, then you recapture, and then you use it for energy generation, which we believe gas is part of our transition. The second intervention that I'll speak about would be, Nigeria is focused on how do you then push the access through. So we've gone for some specific types of World Bank and DFI loans. So for example, we have what you call the DARES project, which is distributed access for renewable energy scale-up. And this is really a $750 million facility that is going to catalyze $1 billion private sector participation. And this is supposed to then try to close the access gap by about 17.5 million people. And how does that work? We're focusing on areas where there's no grid connection, right? And we then focus on projects that are solar home systems, mini grids, microgrids. This allows you to be able to deliver energy where there is no grid access, and then ensure that there's productive use connected to that. Because in a lot of these areas, if there is no productive use, then you are not catalyzing the opportunity to develop industrial use and to develop ability for people to earn money and eventually be able to pay for the cost of electricity. So I'll say that is how we've looked at it from that perspective of gas flaring, and then making specific interventions where we are looking at cheap concessionary funding to developers to be able to drive access by giving them some concessionary loans and then raising the balance by the private sector, but by choosing sites that have a balance between productive use and just residential consumption. This way, you're also able to deliver that just access to a certain extent to those people that do not have any energy access at the moment.
Wonderful, thank you. You're quite right. The idea is not to beat, to make a contribution. So I'd like to now turn to the audience. I do see a question in the chat. Let me take that question first. Are there opportunities for African countries to collaborate, leverage their individual natural endowments, but collectively benefit from the region's transitions? I think you touched on that a little bit, Mark. Do you want to pick up on that one?
I mean, the simple answer is yes.
So can move on to the second question. What are the challenges? What are the challenges?
But if I was an engineer, like the minister, I would say the technical solutions are obvious. But the problem is finance. I really don't think we are having a decent enough discussion about that.
Yeah.
I mean, 63% of climate finance is debt. Only 16% of that is concessional. Only 5% is grants. 32% is equity. We need to come, if you want all of that great stuff, we need massive increases in private sector investment. But that's not going to happen if the cost of capital doesn't come down. If we don't have a global agreement on guarantees to leverage private sector investment and that kind of thing, especially an African maybe approach, it's not going to happen on scale. We'll have the standard banks of life who do some nice projects, sorry. But it's not enough. Come on, guys, it's just not enough. And at an international level, we have to completely rethink special drawing rights. The IMF issues special drawing rights to the richer countries. It should be regularly issued to poorer countries, especially African countries, in order to create the liquidities that we need. These are the combinations of mechanisms that start to unlock capital. And we don't have a very good understanding of how the African financial systems work, just by the way. Unless we think in terms of unlocking multiple flows of capital, those great things are not going to happen, no matter how good your engineers are.
Wonderful. Can I see your hands, and then I will point. Okay, that's telling me we've got 10 minutes left. Wonderful. Anyone in the room? Not yet. Right at the back there. One belong. Please introduce yourself to the panel, and then put your question through.
Morning, everyone. Audrey Gatawa, Standard Bank. It's more of a comment than a question. I think when we talk about unlocking capital, a big challenge in the African context is that it's very difficult to make a business case for some of these initiatives at scale. And one of the things that we should be doing is looking at the just transition from a development context. So one of the things that I would like to hear more in the conversation is how are we thinking of our just transition strategies across Africa, whether it's regional or at national level, but starting from a development context, because unless we can pick up on development, it's going to be very difficult to make the business case which unlocks capital ultimately. Thank you.
Yep. Deo, do you want to lean into that one?
Yeah, okay. So I think you're correct that it has to be driven from a development perspective. I think if you look at how you are going to drive a just energy transition, and I'll use some of the numbers that have been thrown out. To drive just energy transition in Nigeria, we need $10 billion a year. Now, the government clearly can't afford that. How do you actually get that type of debt? A lot of it has to be concessional funding. Concessional funding that comes at lower interest rates. There is a portion that also talks about the fact that we also need to ensure that we have some blended financing locally. So you have challenges in countries like Nigeria where you do not get significant local currency financing. In South Africa, that's not really an issue. But when you play in the energy sector, you are getting your revenue in local currency. So when you don't have that capacity for blended financing, you're going to run amok at some point in time. And I've seen a lot of developers have that type of challenge. So what we are working with is we're working with DFIs and local financing organizations on how to work on some blended financing that would allow you to be able to get a portion of your loan to be able to catalyze that capital, and then a portion that is local. But focusing purely on the development aspect, without focusing on what is going to drive development, I don't believe that you should just run down that route of just that just transition. That's why I talk about focusing on productive use, looking at areas that do not have energy access. How do you connect them? Are you connecting them to the grid? Are you looking at an off-grid solution? How do you make that tariff affordable? Because when you're also in some of the far-off areas that are not connected, affordability also becomes a big question. How do you link the productive use industry into that area? Are you looking at irrigation? Are you looking at some processing? You have to drive economic value chains around access, around just transition, to actually make it impact on the development capacity of the nation. So I think without adding those things, it doesn't actually deliver what you're truly looking for. And that's why we say that it should just not be transition for transition's sake, but it has to be a holistic view, where you're looking at what is it adding to the local economy? What's your local content? How are you bringing people out of energy poverty? How are you bringing people out of poverty? What additional productive use are you creating? What additional value is this bringing to the gross domestic product? I think these are all things that must be connected to the value chain to truly make this transition just.
Wonderful. So I wonder, maybe as you lean into that, maybe wrap it up with some of your final comments, Mark, because we've just been nudged to move on to the next panel. So I think it's really wonderful that banks, as a question from Standard Bank, are thinking about development. It's a wonderful start in terms of showing us where the world is moving to. Mark, if you want to lean into that, you're welcome to, and maybe give us some of your closing remarks about how we might seek to resolve this just energy transition paradox going forward.
So I've read through all of Africa's NDCs, nationally determined contributions. I'd say 25% of them have a developmental shade, if I can put it that way. Most of them in West Africa, by the way. Many African countries are now moving towards following the South African example of formulating just energy transition investment plans. And my research team is working with quite a few of those. In particular, the role of DFIs and the National Centers for Cleaner Production on the industrial policy side. So I think there's a sensitivity to exactly what you're talking about, finding this balance. But what at the center of your comments, Daya, which I completely agree with, is we can no longer assume from a developmental point of view that national treasuries and fiscal budgets are going to be able to carry the burden of the challenges. Nor can we expect central banks to print money. QE type Africans, it's not going to happen either. So if those two traditional ways of funding development are not going to happen, where's the capital going to come from? If we want the old African position, which is, we're waiting for some external savior to come and bring us the cash, that's also not going to happen. So we actually have to understand the architecture of our financial ecosystems, and that's the work I'm doing for the National Planning Commission. A detailed analysis of financial ecosystems from a systems perspective to start asking the questions, where are the elasticity spaces, that's what we call them, where you can stretch the balance sheets, where you can sweat the balance sheets more effectively. I actually think there's quite a lot of liquidity in the South African economy and in the African economies that are spinning rather than actually being directed into the gross fixed capital formation that we actually need. And how do we mobilize those local liquidities which are sitting in these elasticity spaces where there are balance sheet configurations that simply don't make sense? They work for the people who make fees out of making money, but it doesn't work for development. At the end of the day, if you come to where I live and you go to Camps Bay and you see and you ask who's sitting in the coffee shops with their laptops, it's the asset managers who are making money out of money, earning fees without that capital going to where it must go, which is development.
Sounded like a proper, like a proper developmental sociologist there. Thank you. Can you bring us back to capitalism, please, Renshi?
Sure. I don't know what I can say.
No, back to making money. Back to making money.
I think I just want to end off, and I certainly can't improve on that statement, is just around two aspects. And the one thing that I think is absolutely critical to acknowledge is partnerships. I mean, we've seen the role that we can play by partnering not only with our clients, but with our other financiers, with the DFIs, and making sure that we make an impact in the country, in the environment we operate in. And I think sometimes people underestimate the complexity of some of the markets we operate in. And I think you highlighted, the need to support communities, the need to ensure that you have a development impact and that you crowd in the right financiers. And I really want to leave the thought with you around how impactful we could be through developing and funding this sector, because ultimately it stimulates growth in every single subsector of the economy.
Thank you very much. Finally, Deo, what is the role of government, given this need for unlocking money, this opportunity that Ranger is talking about? What is the role of governments in this conversation?
I think I'll start with the fact that governments must not purely use their balance sheet to fund this whole transition. It will be physically or fiscally not prudent, right? And probably not actually doable. So what is government's role? Is to create the right environment, to create enabling laws, regulations, policies that will attract private sector, that will encourage DFIs. You need to have the right reforms. There are lots of DFIs that will not come and give funding if you don't have the right reforms going to be able to drive, for example, tariff reforms, going for public-private partnerships, competition in the market. I mean, for Eskom, I would say breaking up Eskom into generation, transmission, distribution, having transparency. I think these are all things that you do to create an enabling environment. And I think that must be one of the key jobs of government. And the second part is intervention. I'm still happy with the development question. Where there is developmental requirement, I think government must then be able to intervene. There must be different tools that government has for intervening in specific areas and separating what is commercial and what is not commercial. I think when we evaluate our market, there's a lot of non-commercial connections that must be made. But there are also a lot of commercial connections that could be made. Yeah. They do not require the same type of capital. Yeah. They do not require the same type of developer. You have to rethink, what do you need to do for non-commercial or non-viable connections? And what do you do for viable connections? I think it's the job of government to make this happen on a holistic level.
Thank you, Dea. Let's give him a round of applause. So, as an academic who went to Woodmead, I want to finish with what you get from people that get PhDs. You get 2x2s. And so let me end off with Mark's 2x2. We began with the minister speaking a lot about the auction mechanism, which we didn't speak about. We spent a lot of time talking about the local content requirement. And I think the comment that you made earlier around unlocking liquidity is so important. And we saw it happen in South Africa with a lot of us becoming generators of our own power. And who would have thought there was so much liquidity sitting in people's balance sheets, as you were saying, at home?
80 billion.
That's insane, right? Who would have thought? We reflected a little bit about the role of multinationals and how they are benefiting at the expense of us in the region because of this problem of scale, that market sizing and so forth. I'm so happy that we ended off talking about the development state. And I think there's a role there that all of us need to think about in terms of what role do we play in contributing to development state, because we do need this inclusive, just transition. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.